Welcome, history fanatics, to Mrs. Heron's video playlist, where you will get the best of the best in social studies.
We are working on Unit 3, Africa. Our goal for this unit is to analyze the impact of geography on history, culture, population, government, and the economy of Africa. This unit is split up into 3 chapters. Chapter 6, West and Central Africa. Chapter 7, Southern and Eastern Africa. And Chapter 8, North Africa. Ancient African civilization began as early as 2000 BC with the Nubian civilization in modern-day Sudan. As with all civilizations, Nubia used trade to fund the empire. Nubia traded with the Egyptian Empire to the north. One important aspect of trade is that ideas are also exchanged, which is how Nubia learned the skill of iron making. Another famed kingdom was that of Axum. Axum is believed to be the ancient kingdom of Sheba, mentioned in the Bible. As the story goes, the Queen of Sheba fell in love with King Solomon after visiting his kingdom in Jerusalem. Eventually, they had a child together that would lead the kingdom of Sheba. Today, this is in the nation we know as Ethiopia. Axum went on to become a center for trade, as it had trading ports on the Red Sea. Items like gold, ivory, and spices like myrrh and frankincense were common goods that they traded. Romans and merchants from India would travel to Axum to trade goods and ideas, which is likely how Christianity was first introduced in Ethiopia. By the 300s, the king of Axum converted to Christianity and declared it the official religion of the kingdom. This made Axum very popular among Christian travelers, and the kingdom remained in power for several hundred more years until Muslim traders drove the kingdom to the southern tip of Africa. Ethiopia is still mainly Christian today, and it was the only nation in Africa not to be colonized by Europeans. Western Africa was also home to the Bantu people around 500 AD. The Bantu population grew so large that they eventually had to migrate south to find land large enough to support their people. This massive migration lasted almost 1,000 years. Bantu was actually the language they spoke, so today we refer to them as the Bantu speakers. The Bantu language spread throughout the southern Africa as the people moved further south, and it's still spoken by about 180 million people in Africa today. This is how modern historians know where the Bantu speakers began and where they ended their migration. The Bantu also taught other African groups new farming techniques and metal tool making, such as iron. Today, many of the cattle-raising tribes in eastern Africa are descendants of these Bantu people. The Kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, or the Stone House, was founded by the Bantu people in southern Africa. It thrived from around the 1100s to the 1400s AD. This grand kingdom eventually fell at the hands of European colonizers. However, its huge concrete walls still stand to this day and are a popular tourist attraction in the area. It's how modern nation of Zimbabwe got its name. Some Eastern traders brought the religion of Islam to Eastern Africa. A few of these traders settled in the eastern coast of Africa and on an island called Zanzibar, where they expanded the slave trade and spread Arab culture throughout the region. It was on the island of Zanzibar that between 60 and 90% of the native African people were enslaved and forced to work on clove plantations. Many others, including the Bantu people of Tanzania and Mozambique, were sent to other African nations like Egypt and Somalia, or sold throughout the Southwest Asia by Arab merchants. In the 1500s, the Portuguese gained control of the eastern trade routes, including the slave trade. The Eastern and Southern African people suffered from the transatlantic slave trade, similar to the Eastern and Central Africans. Within 300 years, European nations began to imperialize this region as well. Some of the European colonies were founded by trading companies like the Dutch East India Company, who started the Cape Town settlement in South Africa, which eventually led to many other European settlers living in this region. The settlers in Cape Town became known as Boers, which is Dutch for farmers. Soon, the settlers found diamonds and gold in the region, which attracted more settlers and led to Great Britain taking the colony in 1795. The native African people did not appreciate the European rule, as it typically resulted in a loss of land for the locals, it forced labor for little to no pay, and it was a loss of political power for the locals. The European settlers held an attitude of superiority called ethnocentrism, which basically means that they thought they were better than the local people. The British colonial leader, Cecil Rhodes, is one example of ethnocentrism. However, not all British people were as ignorant as Rhodes was. By 1833, the British government outlawed slavery in Britain and even began fighting it throughout Africa. They introduced modern health care, they built railroads and other infrastructure, and implemented education in schools. Soon, African people were ready to take back what belonged to them. By 1960, many African nations gained independence from their European oppressors. One tribe that fought colonization was the Kikuyu people in Kenya. They began their own political party in the 1940s that used violent tactics and force called Mau Mau to end the British rule more quickly. By 1963, Kenya gained independence, and soon the nation built factories and improved city life, meaning that many people left rural farming to work in these cities. This made countries in Kenya and South Africa very wealthy. Unlike Kenya, who was controlled by the native black population, some nations like South Africa and Zimbabwe remained in the control of the white settlers. South Africa gained its independence in 1910. In 1948, a cruel and racist policy was placed in action throughout the nation that forced all white and black South Africans to stay separated. This was called apartheid. It was very similar to American segregationist laws. Apartheid meant that black people could only live or work in certain places, and they were restricted with where they could travel. Schools and hospitals were segregated, black people were not allowed to vote, and interracial marriage was made illegal by the Mixed Marriages Act. Apartheid continued into the 1980s, when an anti-apartheid movement began throughout the United States. Americans began to protest and demand that corporations stop doing businesses in South Africa. Even the American government became involved when they passed the Comprehensive Anti-Apartheid Act in 1986, which banned U.S. companies from investing in South Africa. Black South Africans also tried to organize against the policy. However, they were often met with violence and terror by the white South African police. The South African government tried to stamp out the protests by placing bans on groups like the African National Congress, which was a political party that supported black civil rights. The leaders with the ANC were jailed, with the most famous being Nelson Mandela. He was jailed in Robben Island in 1962 for his work with the ANC, along with F.W. de Klerk, the South African president from 1989 to 1994. F.W. de Klerk was the one who eventually released Mandela from prison in 1990, and together they worked to end apartheid, and they were successful in 1994 when South Africans of every race voted Nelson Mandela president and gained true independence from their oppression.